I will talk about the Geniza through the angle of biblical text, which is my main interest tonight, and there's already a lot to say. So first, of course, what's a Geniza? It comes from the root Gimel Nun Zain, which means to hide or to put away. And there are a few texts in the Jewish traditions, and I found this one from the Mishnah, Shabbat 16. There is in Tractate Shabbat, there's a conversation about can we save religious text, holy text from fire on Shabbat? And there's a lot of conversation around that. Are you breaking the rules of Shabbat or not? And there's this Mishnah which says one may save all sacred writings from a fire, whether they are read on Shabbat or not, i.e., whether they are Torah scrolls or other type of texts. And even though they may be written in different language other than Hebrew, they require storage. And the Hebrew word here used is Geniza in the Mishnah. So Geniza, the first meaning according to the Mishnah, means it's a storage, a place of where we store books. So once a holy book can no longer be used, and in our case we have the case of a fire, and it's not about Shabbat, it's fire in general, it's not permitted to destroy it or to discard it. So the texts containing God's name have either to be buried or to be kept. If we can't bury them, we keep them in the Geniza. And this applies also to texts which are not written in Hebrew but contain God's name. So it's a matter of respect, because in antiquity they had probably much more respect than we have today for the written word, for words in general. So usually Genizot are found in synagogues, attic or basements. They are sometimes found in cemeteries, and we keep them in the Geniza. But in Jerusalem, for example, they have this custom to bury every 7 years. They bury all the text in the cemeteries. So it's a big honor to give someone to say, okay, we will put the text of Geniza in your grave if you don't mind, and people are very honored when we do that. So of course the Cairo Geniza is by far the most well known, and so I was checking how many manuscripts I found. So of course it's a bit complicated because we have between 280,000 and 400,000 fragments and manuscripts. So I guess it depends on how you count them. If you count, these little fragments of text or the folio of the codices, but it's a lot. I think that's really the message, that a lot of them. And not only in Hebrew, but in Aramaic, of course, in Arabic, in Greek, all the language that were that were spoken at the time in this part of the world. So, of course, the other big discoveries of biblical material biblical material is, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the 1940s and 50s in Israel, near the Dead Sea. And some people say, but the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually a Geniza, which I don't think it's true, because it's probably more a place where they were stored to protect themselves from the Romans. So when the Romans destroyed Qumran in 67, I think, all these texts were saved. Okay, let's go now to Fustat. Fustat, which is the place where this Geniza is found. The Ben Ezra synagogue is found in Fustat. So Fustat was the first capital of Egypt under Muslim rule. So when the Muslim occupied Egypt in 641, they built a new capital, which was there. And then, so there's a few dates here in my slide, but we don't need to go into all details. But what's interesting for us is when this Geniza started at the end of the 10th century, the Fatimid dynasty was ruling over Egypt. And in 1168, because of the advance of the Crusaders' armies from the Holy Land to Egypt, one of the vizier decided to destroy Fustat, to burn down Fustat, and it was rebuilt after that. But by then, they moved the capital into Cairo, which is a few miles north of Fustat. So the Jewish community of Fustat. So of
Sorry,
course,
Rene, just
yeah, sure.
because I said I would monitor the chat too.
Oh
So just a
yes.
clarification question was whether the Geniza would be the property of the synagogue or whether it was of a family or whether it would be of both.
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't think it belonged to individuals. It was probably part of a. It was on the synagogue's premises, so it probably belonged to the community itself, and it was the duty of a community to deal with this text. So it's a kind of a mitzvah, if you want, for community. Once you put your text into a Geniza, they don't belong to you anymore. They belong to the synagogue, which is that has to deal with this text. So I guess that's the answer. Yeah, please, Leah, if you have any, yeah, because I can't see the.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm monitoring
Okay,
the
brilliant.
questions and I'll just rudely interrupt.
Absolutely, you can be rude with me. I'm French. I don't mind. So, we don't know exactly when the first Jews settled in Fustat. Probably, when they created the city, the first Jews came. But there's a long established Jewish presence in Egypt, as we know. And before Fustat and Cairo, the big community was in Alexandria, of course. But in Islamic Egypt, the community of Fustat was probably the most important settlement. So later on, we're gonna see a text from a Jewish traveler in the 12th century who came to Fustat and said something about the synagogues. But basically, Jews moving to Fustat were Jews from North Africa, Babylon, and the Holy Land. It was a kind of a crossroad. If I go back to this map, if you look, the Muslim world, goes up this direction towards the east. You have you have Saudi Arabia, you have Iraq, and all this the center of a Muslim world, and in the west, northern Africa up to Spain. So you understand why Fustat was really at a crossroad in the Muslim world. And one of a great Torah commentator, Saadia Gaon, was also a liturgist, was born not far from Fustat in the Fayum, which is about 55 miles in the south. So, as you know, the Jewish community in Egypt began to disappear after 1956, and today there are estimate of 360 Jews still living in the country. So, compared to the heydays of a Jewish presence in Egypt, it's almost nothing nowadays. But there's still a Jewish presence in Fustat. So, the Ben Ezra synagogue, you have here a picture of the interior of the synagogue. So that's apparently the third building here, and you can see the Ezrat Nashim, you can see the bima, you can facing the ark, etc. So that's the most recent version, if you want, of this building. So the first building was destroyed in the early 11th century when one of the local caliphs decided that all Jews and Christians' places of worship should be destroyed. Sometimes we have this idea of life of the Jews under the crescent, which was a kind of paradise. It wasn't the case. They were not, they had people were implementing policies against them, but not always very nice. But the next caliph really decided to allow Jews and Christians to reopen their places of worship, and then a new synagogue was built, destroyed, in this big fire of 1168, and rebuilt after. And now the version of the Ben Ezra synagogue is late 19th century, and it was called the Synagogue of the Levantines, Al Shami'in. So hinting that the Jews that moved to Ben Ezra were originally from the Levant, which is the Middle East, Israel, Lebanon, this part of the world. Okay, so I can't talk about the Geniza without mentioning the question of textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, because I think it's very much part of this construction of our understanding of the history, the textual history of the Hebrew Bible. So textual criticism is a particular biblical criticism which deals with the nature and origin of all the textual witnesses of a text, manuscripts, and it tries to understand the relationship between all these manuscripts, try to understand if there are families of manuscripts, and the idea originally was to try to build an original text, the Urtext, as we say in German, was, the German scholarship was very, very strong in the 19th, 20th century in biblical studies. So they really wanted to go back to this Urtext, as close as possible to when Moses received Torah at Mount Sinai. So that was the idea originally. Of course, it changed over time. We know that this Urtext is I don't know. We don't know if it really existed. It's very difficult to understand. But the method of this type of criticism is actually to compare these manuscripts, to see the variance between the manuscripts, and to assess which one is the oldest one. I'm not going to go into much details because I mean it's very interesting. If you're a bit of a nerd like me, you'll get a lot out of it. It's really interesting to put two manuscripts from two different textual traditions and to see the relationship between both. I will give you just a quick example later, but it's not the purpose tonight. So how many textual traditions do we have in the Hebrew Bible? Of course, Qumran was a kind of a turning point in our understanding because up to Qumran, the only text, the older text we had about the Bible were medieval texts. And the Cairo Geniza has got a lot of these medieval codices of the Hebrew Bible. So before that, we don't know. And the Dead Sea Scrolls helped us to go back almost 1,000 years in the past. And we have texts dating back to the 2nd century BCE, which gave us an amazing insight of the history of these texts. So when we put all these biblical texts together, we can see that there are basically three main textual traditions of the Hebrew Bible. So what we call the proto-Masoretic text, and I say proto because it's before the Masorah, and this is the text that the Masoretes who put the vowels, the scintillation signs which help us to read the text today, did their work in the Middle Ages. So this proto-Masoretic text, which became the Masoretic text, is actually the mainstream Hebrew text, the one we're using in our synagogues, in the translations of the Bible. We have one main tradition, which was probably already in use at the Second Temple period, because in order to establish a religious text of this strength, you need authority. You need religious authority to say this is the authoritative text. And this tradition, which is the most important, is the one we're using today. And it's on this tradition that in the Middle Ages, the Masoretes will put all these signs which will help us to read it. There's another version which is much more limited to a certain community, which we call the Samaritan Pentateuch, and it's mainly the 5 books, first book of the Torah, which use, and I will show you later how it's written, early Hebrew script, and it's preserved by the Samaritan community, which is it's very difficult, if you go into the history of a Samaritan, it's a group that emerged after the first exile as a different group within the Jewish world, and they have a specific text of the Torah where the emphasis is not on the Temple Mount as we have in our Torah, which sets the Temple Mount in Jerusalem as the locus, as the central point of religious life in biblical time. For them, it's a bit north. It's Mount Gerizim, which is near the city of Shechem, Sichem, Samaritan, but also Shamarim, the one who guards the Torah text. So that's a small group, and they have their own text, which looks like this. I don't know if you can see very much. So it's early Hebrew script. It's British Library manuscript from 1339, so it's quite a recent one. I'm going to try to make it a bit bigger if I can, just to give you an idea how it look like. I have no idea which part of the Torah it is. I try to find out, but I can't read the early Hebrew scripts, but I can recognize that is early Hebrew script. So it gives you an idea. So there's uh, no vowels here. It's only the consonantal framework. So that's a Samaritan, and that's a codices which comes from the Geniza as well. Okay, and of course the third main traditions is the Proto-Septuagint, which is the original Hebrew text which was used to translate the Bible into Greek. So we know that there's the Septuagint, which is a mainstream biblical text for the Old Testament for the Christians in some Christian churches. It's also a big tradition which probably came from Egypt, to be honest, because the Septuagint was translated in Egypt mainly, and it has also its differences. So I gave you this example of Isaiah 7:14. Just, there's this mention of the young woman will have a child and his name will be called Emmanuel, which is very important in the Christian church as the announcement of the coming of Jesus. So the Hebrew text has almana, which means the young woman, and the Greek has parthenos, which means the virgin. So you see the interest here to compare different traditions, because Mary's virginity comes from the Septuagint, but it's not in the Masoretic tradition. And of course, the biblical scrolls found in Qumran between 1947 and 56 have changed a lot. They confirmed these three traditions, but they also gave hints that there might be other traditions which we don't know more. So in a nutshell, there was a large textual traditions variety in the early stages of post-temple Judaism, and slowly by the first and second century, it became the Masoretic text, which became really the main tradition for rabbinic Jews. And of course, now the question is, what does the Geniza add into that? I can see, do we have questions?
Yes, so I
Yeah,
was just going to come in. So one question
yeah,
was whether it would be okay for us to share the presentation afterwards with the group.
sure. I can
So
send it to
then
you,
we
yes.
can just send it out afterwards. And then the second question was about Samaritan script, whether that's directly Paleo Hebrew script. And I already responded to that in the chat to say that it's a descendant of Paleo Hebrew, but it's not exactly the same.
Yeah.
But you might know more about it than I do, Renee.
No, you're right. That's it. The use of this early Hebrew script is to make it look old, but it wasn't old at all. Sometimes we used old structure so there's this kind of, the past has this kind of gives validity to something, but it was more recent. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe we probably will have a little bit of time in one of the future sessions to look at the project. There's a website where you can help to decode fragments of the Geniza, and it actually gives lots of examples of lots of different scripts. So because there are many different Hebrew scripts that were found in the Geniza. Many more than we knew before, but there were probably more like sort of different handwriting styles and things like that.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Okay, so if we go now into the Geniza and to see what the Geniza is actually is bringing to our understanding of a biblical text. So first, of course, and that's quite logical, the Proto-Masoretic text and the Masoretic text, widely accepted, among all Jews, is of course the most important text that you can find in the Geniza. So in a way, in terms of textual criticism by comparing different traditions, the Geniza is of quite little help. And most I put here a quote, most of the Geniza texts may be linked to one or another of the major medieval codices that served as model for copyists, such as Aleppo, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and Cairo. And our Bibles, the one we're using when we do translations, let me show you, it's a kind um, of the one when you study Bible and you want to study the text itself in its purity, if you want, we use the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is based on the Leningrad manuscript. But it's just one of them. That's interesting. And if you look at what I put down, in the Geniza, we found 6 codices from the 10th century, 8 from the 8th. No, it's probably not the 8. I need to check it. No, 8 from the 11. Sorry, I'm just correcting now as we speak, so I don't forget. And 22 from the 12th century. So there was a lot of copying. And what they found in the Geniza is that the copying technique got better and better. So, the more recent the text became, the more elaborate they were. And they even found in some places illustrations in some of the manuscripts, which is not Jewish at all. If you look at Christian manuscripts, you have all these, how do you say, enluminure. I need my
Illuminations, like an
illumination.
illuminated manuscript.
Yes. So we don't have very much. It's not very in the Jewish world, but in the Geniza they found a lot of, not a lot. I mean, they found some of them.
So there is a question here about what exactly is a codex? What are codices?
Okay.
Is it a whole manuscript?
So that's a codex. It's the equivalent of a book. So basically, you take pages which you bind together. Uh, 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 it's not like we use in the synagogue, we use a scroll, which was the oldest way of putting books together. They created this kind of books. It's like a modern books, if you want. And also what they found in the Geniza is they used more and more paper instead of the vellum, which was very expensive to produce. So, and of course, because we're in Egypt and the weather is dry, so this paper actually were well kept. So one of the main, if you want, uh, uh, what's the word? The major discovery that we found in the Geniza is in the area of vocalizations of the Hebrew Bible. So I gave here an example of the one we know. Uh, I'm trying to make it a bit bigger now. That's the vocalization of Aaron ben Asher, who lives in Tiberias in the 10th century. And you have all these signs, that's the beginning of the book of Joshua, Vayehi, so you have Revi, Vayehi, Acharei, Mot. I don't know how to vocalize to sing it because it's the book of Joshua, but I say Vayehi Acharei Mot Moshe Heved Adonai Vayomer Adonai. So it's exactly what we would use as Torah tropes, but they're used throughout the entire Bible. And that's what we know, which is really standard today. And until the 19th century, to be honest, people thought that, okay, it was only that. And then they discovered at least 3 different ones. The quote here from the book of Rafe, they said, it's now clear that the standard Tiberian system of Ben Asher, so sanctified since the period of late manuscript and early prints by both tradition and scholarship, was only one of a number of such systems that were in vogue throughout the Jewish world. So they found 3 major systems, one which was supralinear Palestinian above, one sublinear Tiberian, and one supralinear Babylonian. So I'm going to show you one. So we had this one, of course, the Ben Asher one, which is supralinear Tiberian. And then we have this one, which is Palestinian vocalization, again, also from from the Geniza. So you see the signs, instead of being below, are above. But you find the same. Here you have, for example, you have a Segol, you have a Shva. Yeah, you can recognize a Tsere here. So they almost look the same, but it's placed in a different place. So one of the reason, oh gosh, what's happening? One of the reasons of that is some people have suggested, but because they lived in a Muslim environment, and we know how much Arabic scholars were strong in vocalizing the Quran. And even the first grammarians of Hebrew were actually Arab grammarian. People were, we learned how to establish the grammar of a language. The Arabs were very, very strong in all these areas of linguistics. So some people say that maybe that comes from the Quran way of vocalizing the text, because you have to have it right. It's the Bible. It's not a shopping list. So it has to be really accurate because it's God's word, and you can't make a mistake. So they gave this to allow people to be able to read it properly. There's another example here of Babylonian vocalization, and as you can see here, let me enlarge it. Uh, yeah, so here what you see, there are much less signs, which presuppose that people knew how to read that. And look, if you go to Israel and you learn Hebrew at school, they learned that before the vowels. They know how to read the consonants, and they use the vowels only sometimes in the press, to make sure that one word is what we think, and also in poetry, and of course in religious texts. But people can function without vowel in these languages, because it's when you learn Hebrew, it seems a bit weird, but actually it makes a lot of sense. And another example of Babylonian vocalization, another Geniza text from the Deuteronomy. So you see again, uh, uh, all the signs are above the line and helps. And I think it's the Quranic way. I'm not sure now. I think in the Quran, people they put the signs. I'm not sure. I don't know Arabic, so I don't want to say.
It's in Arabic. It's a bit of both.
Okay,
So
okay.
some dots are underneath it, but normally most of the vowels are above in Arabic. It's you're right. Um, Sybil has a question about what language were people using at the time.
Or mainly Arabic. So that's also something interesting that the Geniza has demonstrated is that, of course, they knew Hebrew, they still knew Hebrew. They also knew Greek, because in this part of the Roman Empire, people would speak Greek, but they developed, and we have the early stages of Judeo-Arabic in the Geniza as well. So we can find texts that show the some early written examples of this language, which will be widespread throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa. And Judeo-Arabic, you can see some example there as well. But in the daily life, they would speak Arabic. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Another thing which is very interesting, which people discovered, the discussions between Orthodox and progressive, how do you read Torah? And so do you read the whole cycle the whole Torah in 1 year, or do you have a triennial cycle and you read a third? And for many years, people thought that actually, you know what? People have, since the creation of the world, people have always read the Torah in 1 year. And what they discovered in Fustat is that actually no, that wasn't the case. And we have already this. I found it very, very nice. This a quote from Benjamin of Tudela, was a Spanish Jew. He died in 1173. So he, oh gosh, another mistake here. So I'm correcting as I'm not very good in proofreading my text, to be honest. So he left Spain to go to the Holy Land, and en route, if you want, he wrote, things he had seen in the Jewish communities. Were kind of a guidebook of Jewish communities at that time, which is amazing because it gives us so many interesting information. And this is what he says about Fustat. Two large synagogues are there, one belonging to the men of the land of Israel, and one belonging to the men of the land of Babylon. The synagogue of the men of the land of Israel is called Kenisat al-Shamein, and the synagogue of the men of Babylon is called Kenisat al-Irakin, Iraq. Their usage with regard to the portion and section of the law is not alike. For the men of Babylon are accustomed to read a portion every week, as is done in Spain. So that's a good, interesting indication, and is our custom, and to finish the law each year. While the men of Palestine do not do so, but divide each portion into 3 sections and finish the law at the end of 3 years. The two communities, however, have established custom to unite and pray together on the day of rejoicing, which is Simchat Torah. So we have an indication of Simchat Torah in the 12th century, which is interesting because we don't really know when this festival was actually created, but here we know that in the 12th century they would celebrate it, and on the day of the giving of the law, which is Shavuot, which is a biblical festival. So here you see we have these two traditions. One comes from Palestine, one comes from Babylon, and of course the Babylonian custom became the widespread custom all over the Jewish world. And when the first liberal Jews in the 19th century in Germany, actually, they started there using the Palestinian cycle. People say, "Oh, you traitors!" And I said, "No, look, look what they did. Huh? They did the same already in Palestine." Huh? So all these two cycles are actually well documented in the Geniza as well, which is very interesting.
Sorry to just interrupt.
Sure.
So I think so. We're going to come back to some of this question about Palestinian tradition being different to Babylonian tradition that we've learned from the Geniza, also in the liturgy session, because one of the things that progressive liturgists have done is similarly take things that were already part of the Palestinian custom that we found in the Geniza and so on, to replace that with what became the dominant Babylonian custom, because they were often it seemed Palestine was more liberal than than Babylonia, which is there's an interesting question there. So we'll come back to some of that also with the liturgy question, but. Just because we're sort of at the end of this slide, to come in with a question that David Kirk put for us, is if you could say something about the dating of the manuscripts and what's likely the earliest date of the documents that were found. And if we don't answer it today, I know that probably in next week's session that should be covered. But if you do happen to know the answer, then you can probably give David and all of us an answer to that question right now.
Okay, so what's obvious is that this text, cover the whole time of the Geniza between the 10th, the 9th century and its discovery, because it was used for a long time. But they discovered texts which went back to the 7th century CE, not BCE, 7th century CE. So they put already older text into the Geniza. But most of them are medieval texts. Most of them date from the medieval times. Right. Okay, so there were other aspects of the Geniza which are more less systematic, if you want. So they discovered, and I found it very interesting because here in the West it would be considered as sacrilegious in a way. So they found Syriac and Greek versions of the Bible, i.e., Christian Bibles, that were used as palimpsests. That means that they erase the text on the parchments to write Hebrew text. So of course, the question is why? How can you deface in a way a religious text? And so one of the answers I found is probably because these texts came from the Muslim leaders who gave them to the Jews and to reused. They also found Targumim, fragments of Targumim in the Geniza, which were not known before that, and the early Arabic Hebrew dictionaries, which is very interesting. As I said a few minutes ago, the understanding of a language through grammar and dictionaries really stemmed from the Arabic world. There is the famous commentary of Saadia Gaon, which was written in Arabic. And also there is one community which I haven't mentioned yet, which is also present in the Geniza, the Karaites, which were Jews who didn't believe in the rabbinic tradition. So the Karaites are Jews, but they are not rabbinic Jews. And there was a big Karaite community in Egypt, and I think today there are about 30 or 50,000 Karaites in Israel, in Ashdod, and most of them are from Egypt, originally from Egypt. And some of their works are preserved, of course, in the Geniza. Okay, so as a conclusion, good. I'm very happy because I managed to keep my time as I wanted to allow people to talk. So biblical material is only one of the many types of manuscript found in the Geniza. So you will hear other sessions about liturgy, about daily life, and there are, hundreds and hundreds of different types of manuscripts. The Masoretic textual tradition is overwhelmingly present in the Geniza because the oldest manuscripts that date back from the 7th century at a time when the Masoretic tradition was widespread everywhere. The Greek tradition wasn't used by Jews at all. It was used by the Christian churches, and the Samaritan traditions was used by the Samaritans, obviously. The discovery of a variety of vocalization systems is also something that came out of the Geniza. What did I write? The manuscript reveal a variety of vocalization system, all based on the mainstream Hebrew text accepted throughout the Jewish world. And there is indeed, and that's very interesting for our purpose of textual tradition, there is a textual unity in the Geniza that has allowed some to suggest an earlier master copy of this tradition. And I'm not sure about that because I saw in one of my readings, we went back to the time of Ezra, when there was this public reading of the Torah in the temple of the Torah scroll. But there is a textual unity there. And lastly, for the history of the Jewish languages, these manuscripts give some insight into the formation of Judeo-Arabic, particularly with the commentaries in Arabic of the Bible. I think I've finished. Thank you for your attention. And I'm very happy to answer any question if I can, obviously.
Thank you, thank you. And just before I take questions, I want to just clarify what we're going to, what next week's session is also going to focus on. So next week's session is going to focus on a little bit of how did we actually find the Geniza, because it's really a fascinating story that we haven't covered at all, of how can it be that this treasure trove and what makes the Geniza of Fustat so unique. And that we'll look at next times. But thank you so much, Rabbi Rene, for this fascinating insight into manuscript. I'm sure there are some other questions. Feel free to ask questions. If there are questions we'll be better equipped answering in future sessions, we'll just tell you. And probably Rabbi Rene knows way more answers than I do. So if you have questions, just unmute yourself and ask the question that you might want to ask. I can see Sybil has unmuted herself, so go ahead.
Can I just ask one question? You mentioned that the manuscripts were waiting to be buried every 7 years. Did the 7 years correlate to the 7 years that the had they got to having 7 years fallow and 7 years reaping, or was that later?
I think so. That's a particular custom for Jerusalem, and it's connecting to the Shrita. It's connecting to the 7 years. Yeah, so that's
yes.
Yeah, that's probably.
So it would have been the same time that they would bury these.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All together. Yeah.
All together. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
May I ask a question about Aramaic? What were medieval Jews in Cairo doing, writing, or even studying in Aramaic? One might expect they were speaking Arabic and praying in Hebrew, that their interest in Aramaic would have been rather slight. Where does Aramaic fit into the picture?
So the Gemara, the Gemara part of the Talmud is in Aramaic, mainly in Aramaic. So they had to know Aramaic for this purpose. And there are other texts. I don't know how much they knew about the Zohar, for example, or the Kabbalistic text, but they're mostly. And the Zohar is a bit later, but these texts are written in Aramaic as well.
So and also probably the Jews of Palestine didn't speak Arabic. So in order to communicate with the Jews of Palestine, they probably had to communicate in Aramaic rather than being able to write to them in Arabic.
Yeah.
So is it right to regard Aramaic as a vernacular language that was in widespread use in by 1100?
I'm not sure if it was still widespread. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to. I think Aramaic was spoken earlier than that. Persian Empire. In the daily life, Aramaic was probably earlier.
And it was the language, I think we all accept, of Judea in the 1st century, time of Jesus. So I was just curious as to how it survived 1,000 years, but
yeah, through religious texts mainly. Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And also, Mike Gordon adds that it was a language of trade, so it wasn't just Jews that spoke Aramaic, and therefore it was still a vernacular in also with the non-Jewish world. I think the one thing that maybe I'm not sure if we discussed yet, but that the interesting thing is about a lot of the text that is written, that we have a lot of manuscripts that are also written in Hebrew letters, but the language is Arabic. So just like we get with Yiddish later on in Ladino, so that the tradition remained to write in Hebrew script, but to write in the foreign language. I'm not sure if there are also examples of Greek texts in Hebrew letters. That I'm not sure. But definitely many of the texts in Arabic were in Hebrew letters. And in the beginning, at the very beginning, when they discovered the Geniza and looked at some of the fragments, that caused a lot of confusion among scholars, because they had partly very short fragments and trying to figure out which language it is. And there is a lot of similarity between Arabic and Aramaic also. So trying to figure out which language even a text is in was quite complicated. And one of the fascinating things around Geniza scholarship is that for the first time it presented Jews and Jewish scholars with the hurdle that they had to learn Arabic. Because in order to be able to discern the different texts, you had to be able to understand Arabic. And oftentimes they muddled things even. So the introduction will be in in Hebrew, and then the rest will be in Arabic, or they'll have an Arabic text, but with Hebrew quotes because they are quoting a biblical passage or whatever. So some of the challenge is even to figure out which language a text is in. And this is like why so much of the Geniza scholarship has really taken off only in the last 10, 15 years, because scholars had to re-equip themselves. Many of the really important scholars just had never learned Arabic, because why would you have learned Arabic, right? So there's lots of really exciting material that nobody knows anything about yet, because we just haven't really had enough expertise in the scholarship community to be able to decipher all of these things. Gary, yeah.
Yes. If I could just make a comment. First of all, Rabbi Pfertzel, that was magnificent. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I've had the privilege actually of having a tour like a couple of the others personally of the Cambridge, and had a whole day there. And it was one of the most moving occasions. And to see the letter, as was mentioned, from Maimonides in Maimonides' own handwriting to his brother David was very touching. But the thing is, what we are talking about here are really the Sephardim, because, we talk about Palestine. Another thing I have a thing about, we talk about the Palestinian Talmud, we ourselves refer to the land of Judea and Samaria as Palestine, renamed by the Romans when they destroyed the temple because it was the name of the Philistines. And here we are, we're talking about the Palestinian Talmud, we're talking about Palestine generally. However, these were the Sephardim. The great center was really in Babylon, in the two academies in Sura, in Pumbedita, with Saadia Gaon, and then with the changeover of some of the caliphates that moved to Spain, and then it was all Sephardim. We are of the Ashkenazim in Europe, but this is Sephardi period. This is the Sephardis. They were Arabic speaking. It was just as we speak in English, they spoke in Arabic. This was the language of prayer, just like it's the language of prayer now. And I just find this whole thing very moving, that we have this history with us now, and so much is being unearthed. And I look forward to the story of Solomon Schechter and the whole discovery of the thing. But thank you so much. I'm so thrilled. I'm really just so excited about all this.
Thank you, Gary. Yes. So
Thank
what's
you.
interesting
This is why we got so excited. I don't remember. I think I spoke in my Hebrew class. Something came up where I said, "Oh, we learned about this. We found out about this in the Cairo Geniza." And then somebody said Cairo Geniza, and I said, "Oh, this is exciting. We gotta do an adult education course." And then I had the pleasure of sharing a house with Rabbi Rene Pfertzel before he was a rabbi and before I was a rabbi. And I remembered, if I need a good partner in crime, he is absolutely the right person. He's going to get as excited as I am about this. So yes, thank you. So I'm still very much looking forward to all of this.
Could I just say something apropos the last gentleman? Who was talking about the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim. I am of origin an Iraqi Jew from India, and as early as I can remember, I didn't know such a language as Yiddish existed. It was a complete new thing for me. But as early as I can remember, my family would bring Arabic into our language. My mother would always say, Inshallah. Mazel Tov, which I'd never heard of, was actually Mubarak. And I only had Arabic words thrown into the language, which would bear out what the other gentleman was saying, that about having an Arabic language, which is the only language I was familiar with.
Yeah, but Celia Naval, who is on the call, so we were together in the same community in Lyon. I was a rabbi there for 2 years, and I worked with them long before. And I remember anytime we would have high holidays Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we have Chazanim who were from North Africa, and they would bring the North African liturgy, which was just amazing, full of joy, etc. But at the same time, so different for us. So it's like, okay, so and people loved it. People really loved it because it reminded them of the youth in North Africa. So and the Hebrew pronounced with the Arabic accent is very different. Yes, yeah.
I don't think we appreciate how advanced the Arabs were in those period, around in the Babylonian period. They brought the whole of Greek philosophy. It had gone. It was the Arabs who brought the Greek philosophers, to the Western world. And look what's happened to them now. I mean, they were way ahead. We followed them to a certain extent in Babylon with the great academies, and there was huge interchange between the two communities. And it's just, I'm just very sad to have seen what's happened in the Muslim community from their great learning and their great traditions.
And of course, without the Arabs, you wouldn't have a zero, and so we wouldn't have mathematics as we have, and so on.
Yes.
Would it be that bad? No mathematics.
That would be great.
Medicine, no, because so much of the medicine that was used right up until probably the 19th century came from the Arabs as well. And certainly a lot of the words that are used are from Arabic.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's fantastic. And I think one of the fascinating things, and we'll see this this throughout exploring this course, is that I think because we started to have this dominance of the Ashkenazi culture, which really started to perpetuate the Jewish world, we often forgot about this unbelievable wealth of knowledge, and there was sort of a little bit, partly because I think the Jews picked up the same stereotypes as their Christian neighbors of the Orientalism that looked down on people in Africa and so on, that the Jewish world also started to forget about how incredible and how much knowledge there was coming out of the Arabic speaking world. And I think one of the really unbelievable things about the Geniza is that it has brought it really to the forefront, and really this incredible wealth of knowledge that we have gained, and these hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. I mean, to imagine that there are, the moderate guess is 200,000 manuscripts. I mean, everyone with a library would think, wow, I have 200,000 books, right? But of course, in a sense, it's not so surprising, because if we look at, I don't know how many had the chance to to go to the exhibition about Assyria that was at the British Museum, where it was the library on the tablets, where they had also hundreds of thousands of these little stone tablets, right? So it was part of this culture that it was actually a very literate culture. And we'll discover that, they wrote letters home and on issues such as banal as your child is misbehaving in school, and could you please threaten your child with a spanking? so your child will behave better next time. So we'll look forward to sharing some of these gems. Hopefully we'll be able to bring to you a little bit of the sacred, like what Rabbi Pfertzel brought today, and we'll look at some liturgy, but also a little bit of the banal, the letters to about the naughty child, and so on, because I think that's part of this amazing discovery that the Geniza has brought for us. So thank you so much to all of you, especially thank you to Rabbi Rene. This is the best way of co-teaching. I didn't have to do anything today.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll get to do some work for another session. And we look forward to seeing you next week, I think.
Can I just say something?
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. It was just that Simon Sharma's book on the history of the Jews is very good on this early era and the contribution of Arabs and Greeks and so on.
Yeah, and of course he's very much informed by the findings of the Geniza also,
Yes,
because he comes after that. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very
Bye.
interesting.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.